It was a warm evening in downtown Arlington, the golden glow of streetlights reflecting off the lively sidewalks. The air was filled with the hum of conversations, the occasional laughter spilling from bustling cafes and boutique shops. Elijah Grant, a highly decorated Navy SEAL on leave, walked at an unhurried pace, blending effortlessly into the crowd. Dressed in a fitted gray t-shirt, well-worn jeans and sneakers, he carried a leather messenger bag slung casually over one shoulder. For the first time in months, his mind was at ease. He was on his way to a small, independent bookstore to pick up a novel he had long meant to read. Just as he stepped onto the crosswalk, the sharp screech of tires tore through the evening's peaceful rhythm. The unmistakable sight of a police cruiser pulling up to the curb sent a ripple of unease through the pedestrians. A white police officer emerged, Officer Carden. His movements were slow, deliberate, predatory, his piercing blue eyes locked onto Elijah, scrutinizing him with an intensity that felt less like an assessment and more like a verdict already decided. "Hey, you!" Carden's voice cut through the din of the street, loud and commanding. Elijah halted mid-step, his muscles instinctively tensing, though his expression remained unreadable. He turned his head, meeting the officer's gaze with quiet steadiness. "You're in a hurry, aren't you?" Carden continued, his tone laced with suspicion. "Mind telling me where you're headed?" The question, though seemingly innocent, carried a weight that settled heavily in the air between them. A few passers-by slowed their steps. Their curiosity piqued, while others continued on, their body language suggesting they had witnessed scenes like this too often to linger. Elijah, ever composed, tilted his head slightly. "Just heading to the bookstore," he replied, his voice level, betraying nothing. Carden crossed his arms over his chest, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Bookstore, huh?" His gaze flickered to the leather bag at Elijah's side. "And what's in the bag? You carrying anything I should know about?" The implication was clear. Elijah felt the weight of countless silent stares pressing in on him. The officer's words were laced with something all too familiar: prejudice, wrapped neatly in the guise of protocol. Yet instead of anger, a different emotion flickered behind Elijah's dark eyes. It wasn't fear. It wasn't submission. It was something far more unsettling for a man like Carden: quiet, unshakable confidence. "You want to check?" Elijah asked, his voice unwavering, his gaze steady. Carden straightened ever so slightly, clearly taken aback by the response. He had expected defensiveness, maybe even compliance. Not this calm defiance. His jaw tensed. "I'll be the one asking questions," he snapped, his fingers twitching near his utility belt. A murmur rippled through the growing crowd. More people had stopped now, their faces taut with anticipation. Phones began to emerge, held discreetly at first, but soon without pretense. Elijah, still poised, shifted his stance ever so slightly. It was the kind of movement that spoke volumes. Not a retreat, not an act of resistance, but a measured assertion of self. Something about him, his stillness, his unwavering eye contact, made Carden hesitate. "All right, officer," Elijah said, his tone as controlled as before. "Let's do this the right way." The tension in the air thickened. Carden's face hardened, his authority seemingly slipping from his grasp. He took a step closer, his boots clicking against the pavement. "Drop the bag," he ordered, his voice sharper now, as if volume alone could mask the uncertainty creeping into his posture. Elijah held his gaze, then, after a brief pause, he carefully slid the strap from his shoulder and extended the bag toward the officer. But there was no submission in the act, only a deliberate calculation, a controlled offering meant to expose the moment for what it truly was. Carden snatched the bag, his fingers curling tightly around the worn leather. "Hands behind your back," he barked, reaching for the handcuffs at his belt. At that, Elijah arched an eyebrow, his expression unflinching. "Am I under arrest?" His voice was steady, his words precise. Carden hesitated for half a second too long before recovering. "You're being detained," he shot back, avoiding a direct answer. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for." The absurdity of the statement hung between them like a bad joke. A few members of the crowd exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from curiosity to outrage. Somewhere a woman muttered under her breath, "Here we go again," Elijah exhaled slowly, the faintest hint of a smirk ghosting across his lips. "All right, Officer Carden," he said, his voice almost too even, too composed. "Let me help you out." He took a careful step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. "Stay right there," Carden warned, his hand hovering dangerously close to his holstered weapon. Elijah stilled, then lifted his hands slightly in a gesture of compliance. "Relax," he said, his tone measured. "I'm just giving you my ID." He reached into his back pocket with calculated slowness, extracting a sleek card holder. From it, he pulled out a single card and extended it toward the officer. Carden's eyes flicked downward. He hesitated, then took the card. His smirk faded the instant he read the words engraved into the military ID, United States Navy SEAL. The transformation was almost imperceptible, but Elijah caught it, the flicker of doubt, the brief faltering of confidence. It lasted only a second before Carden's expression hardened once more. He clenched his jaw and tossed the ID back into Elijah's waiting hands. "This doesn't mean you're above suspicion," Carden muttered, his voice laced with forced authority. "Stay put while I check your bag." Elijah tucked his ID away, crossing his arms over his chest. A quiet amusement danced in his gaze now, a look that said more than words ever could. "Go ahead, officer, dig yourself deeper." As Officer Carden yanked the zipper open and began sifting through Elijah's bag, the air thickened with tension. The world around them seemed to shrink. The hum of passing cars and distant conversations drowned beneath the weight of anticipation. The growing crowd leaned in, their faces illuminated by the glow of their phone screens, each camera lens capturing every movement as if documenting an unfolding scandal. Elijah took a single deliberate step back, his calm demeanor now carrying a quiet intensity, something unshakable, almost theatrical. "Make sure everyone gets a good look at what you find," he said smoothly, his voice carrying just enough weight to turn the officer's search into something far more than routine. It was a spectacle now, and the audience was watching with rapt attention. Carden crouched slightly, yanking the bag open wider, his fingers brushing over its contents before pulling out the first item, a book. The title glared up at him in bold print. "Leadership Under Pressure, A SEAL's Guide to Resilience and Excellence." He turned it over in his hands, almost as if he expected something more sinister to be concealed between its pages. "What's this?" Carden demanded, holding the book aloft as though it were something illicit, something incriminating. Elijah didn't flinch. His expression remained even, though there was now a glint of something unreadable in his dark eyes. Something dangerously close to amusement. "That," he said, his voice smooth and unwavering, "is a book I wrote." For the first time since the encounter began, Carden hesitated. His fingers tightened around the book's spine as if grasping for control. "You wrote this?" he echoed, disbelief dripping from each syllable. "That's what I said," Elijah responded, tilting his head slightly. "Unless you'd like me to prove it by signing a copy for you? Or would you rather keep rummaging through my things?" A ripple of laughter surged through the crowd, swift and sharp. Carden's face burned crimson beneath the harsh glow of streetlights. His jaw clenched, his grip tightening on the book before he shoved it back into the bag with unnecessary force, as though attempting to reassert control over a situation slipping through his fingers. "Cut the attitude," he snapped, his voice brittle with frustration. "This isn't over." Elijah merely raised his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. "I'm not the one making a scene here," he said, his tone light but edged with something firm, something immovable. "I'm just trying to go about my day." Ignoring him, Carden continued his search, pulling out the next item, a sleek black laptop. He turned it over, inspecting it as though expecting to find something illicit hidden beneath its smooth exterior. When nothing appeared to justify his suspicions, he set it aside and reached for the last item, a small, leather-bound journal. Flipping it open, Carden's eyes swept over the pages. Unlike the careless authority with which he had handled the rest of Elijah's belongings, his movements slowed now, his fingers tracing the neat, precise handwriting within. One passage caught his attention. "You don't fight for recognition. You fight because it's the right thing to do. Leadership isn't about power, it's about service." For a moment, Just a moment. Carden stilled. His fingers hovered over the inked words, and something unreadable flickered across his face. Maybe recognition, maybe something deeper. But just as quickly, the mask slid back into place. The crowd murmured restlessly, the energy shifting once more. "Anything illegal in there, officer?" Elijah asked, his voice smooth, but threaded with quiet challenge. Carden snapped the journal shut and shoved it back into the bag, his frustration now palpable, his composure fraying at the edges. "You're free to go," he barked, stepping back as though eager to end the encounter before it unraveled further. Elijah didn't move. He crossed his arms over his chest, his posture unyielding. "Not so fast," he said, his voice low, steady, and laced with authority. "You stopped me, accused me of fitting a description, rifled through my personal belongings in front of all these people." He gestured subtly toward the watching crowd, their phones still raised, recording every second of the exchange. "I think we're owed an explanation." The crowd erupted in agreement, voices rising in a chorus of demands. "What was the reason? You can't just walk away from this. Answer him." The pressure mounted, a tidal wave crashing down upon Carden's once solid foundation. He shifted uneasily, his earlier bravado now dimmed beneath the weight of 100 watchful eyes and a dozen camera lenses poised to capture his every move. Elijah didn't break eye contact. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken truths. "You're not going to answer," Elijah pressed, his voice cutting cleanly through the murmurs. "Tell me, officer, what was this description I supposedly fit?" Carden opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Because there was no description. There had never been one. Just an excuse. A flimsy, paper-thin pretense that had disintegrated the moment Elijah stood his ground. Elijah took a step forward, not aggressive, not threatening, but with the weight of a man who knew exactly what was happening and refused to let it be brushed aside. "Let me guess," he continued, his tone calm, but now razor-sharp. "Black man, walking down the street, minding his own business. That about sums it up, doesn't it?" The crowd gasped, their voices swelling once more. Some murmured in agreement, others shook their heads in exasperation. The truth of it was undeniable, hanging thick in the air, impossible to ignore. Carden's jaw clenched, his lips pressing into a thin, bloodless line. Still, he said nothing. "You see, officer," Elijah went on, his voice measured, deliberate, each word landing with the weight of something undeniable. "This was never about keeping the streets safe. This was about power, about control. You thought you could humiliate me, intimidate me, maybe even escalate this into something worse." He let the words settle before adding, "But you didn't expect me to stay calm, did you?" Carden's face darkened, but he still didn't speak. "You didn't expect me to be a Navy SEAL," Elijah continued, his tone unwavering, his eyes locked onto the officers. "You didn't expect me to have the discipline to stay level-headed, or the experience to see through your game." Silence wrapped around them like a vice. The crowd knew the truth. Carden knew it too. And now, with the entire city watching, there was nowhere left for him to hide. The crowd clung to every word, some murmuring in agreement, others nodding, their expressions a mix of anger and quiet vindication. A few voices rose above the hum, offering small cheers of support, while the rest simply watched, spellbound, waiting to see how this moment would unfold. Elijah shifted slightly, turning toward the growing assembly, his presence commanding, yet composed. His voice, though not raised, carried effortlessly over the restless murmur of the bystanders. "This isn't just about me," he said, the weight of his words sinking into the crowd like stones into deep water. "This is about every person who has been put in this position, people who didn't have a camera recording, who didn't have the training to remain calm, who didn't have the voice or the platform to fight back. This isn't justice. This is harassment, and it needs to stop." A wave of applause rippled through the onlookers, their voices swelling in agreement. The energy in the air shifted, becoming something more than mere spectatorship. It became a reckoning. Officer Carden, who had once stood with rigid confidence, now looked visibly shaken. His mouth opened, then closed again, as if grasping for a justification that simply wasn't there. When he finally spoke, His voice was a weak echo of the authority he had wielded moments ago. I, I was just doing my job, he stammered, his gaze flickering toward the recording phones, toward the faces staring at him with unflinching expectation. Elijah turned back to him, his expression unreadable but filled with something unmistakable, disappointment. If this is how you define your job, he said, his voice steady but sharp, then maybe you're not meant for it. The words struck like a slap. The crowd roared in agreement, voices rising in a chorus of demands. Hold him accountable. File a complaint. Make him answer. Carden glanced around, his authority dissolving under the weight of public outrage. His hands fidgeted at his sides, his once firm stance unraveling with each passing second. Elijah reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, holding it up so that the officer could see. Here's the deal, officer, he said, his voice cutting through the noise with razor-sharp clarity. You're going to stand here, in front of all these people, and explain why you stopped me. He let the words settle, then calmly tapped the screen of his phone. The moment the realization hit, Carden's face paled. Elijah had been recording everything. The officer's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. You don't owe me an apology, Elijah continued, his tone firm yet measured. You owe every single person here an explanation for why you thought you had the right to abuse your power. So go ahead, officer, talk. A hush fell over the crowd. All eyes were locked on Carden. The moment stretched out, thick and suffocating. Beads of sweat gathered at his brow as he shifted uncomfortably, the weight of accountability pressing down on him like a crushing force. I was acting on suspicion, Carden finally stammered, his voice barely holding together. Just doing my duty, trying to ensure public safety. The crowd groaned. Disbelief rippled through them like a wave. A man near the front shook his head. Same old story, he muttered. A woman's voice rang out, clear and sharp. What suspicion? She demanded. Say it plainly. Elijah's expression remained unchanged, but his presence seemed to swell, his mere existence making the space around him smaller for Carden. Suspicion, Elijah repeated, his voice slicing through the moment like a knife. Let's be very clear, officer. Suspicion is not a license to harass. It's not an excuse to stop someone without cause. And it's certainly not justification for targeting someone because of the color of their skin. Carden opened his mouth to object, but Elijah lifted a hand, silencing him before he could speak. The crowd cheered softly at the quiet authority in that single gesture. You want to talk about suspicion? Elijah pressed, his voice rising ever so slightly, carrying an edge now, something unyielding. Let's talk about your actions. You didn't stop anyone else on this street. You didn't ask anyone else where they were going. But you saw me, and that was enough. Carden's face turned red. His composure fractured further beneath the weight of Elijah's words. I wasn't singling you out, he sputtered, though his tone carried no real conviction. Weren't you? Elijah shot back, his voice tinged with righteous indignation. Because I don't see anyone else here being stopped. Or are you going to stand here and tell all of us that every single person on this street fits the same vague description you mentioned? The crowd erupted. Answer him! We see right through you! Carden looked trapped, his earlier arrogance reduced to desperation. His eyes darted from face to face, from phone to phone, from Elijah's unshakable gaze to the reality of the moment crashing down upon him. Elijah exhaled slowly, lowering his voice, but not his intensity. Here's the truth, Officer Carden, he said, his tone quieter now, but no less powerful. You didn't expect me to push back. You thought you could get away with this because you've done it before. Probably more times than you can even count, but not today. He took one step closer, his dark eye. Steady, unwavering. Today you picked the wrong person,